Back in the winter of 1883, out where the sky was wider than most dream sand, the land still breathed wild and free, there came a letter in a girl's trembling hands, a letter from a man she'd never met, promising a new life, a homestead, and love. Clara was a seamstress from Illinois, gentle-hearted with laugh lines, blooming early from too much smiling. Some called her sturdy, some said she had a generous figure, but Clara had a spirit bigger than most men could hold. She wasn't delicate like a prairie flower, she was a blooming sunflower, tall, golden, and unashamed. No, Clara had read all his letters twice over. Jedediah Turner, a rancher from Dry Creek, Wyoming, said he wanted a woman to share his land, cook by his fire, help raise children, and grow old. With this, words were kind, didn't say much about looks. Clara liked it, that made her feel maybe she was enough, so with hope stitched into every corner of her heart, Clara sold everything she had, her little sewing table, her mama's dishes, 7 the lace curtains she'd hemmed by hand. She packed her mama's quill, their sewing kit, and what was left of her life into a single trunk, and she boarded a train west through the heart of winter with nothing but a name, a promise, and a heart full of stars. Train hissed and groaned as it pulled away from Dry Creek's weathered little platform, leaving Clara alone in the swirling snow. She stood there, her trunk by her side, breath misting in the winter air. She smoothed her skirt and clutched her shawl tight, her eyes scanning the empty street. She waited 10 minutes past, then 20. A man led his horse down the road and tipped his hat politely, but kept walking. A group of boys tossed snowballs near the livery. The wind picked up still. She waited. Finally, through the curtain of snowfall, a figure appeared, broad-shouldered, wearing a dusted brown coat and a hat pulled low. Jedediah Turner, he didn't smile, didn't greet her with warmth or take her hand like a man greeting his bride. Walked up slow, nodded once. Miss Jenkins, he said, lifting her trunk onto the back of his wagon without looking her in the eye. Clara's heart sank. Later, behind the barn at his homestead, finally spoke the words she hadn't wanted to her. You were not what I expected. She turned toward him, heart pounding. Go, she asked, voice barely a whisper. You're a fine woman, I can tell, but I was thinking someone a little smaller, more delicate. The words fell like stone as Clara blinked, her throat tightening. She nodded once, quiet, like carefully, like her heart might crack if she moved too fast. See, she didn't argue, didn't plead. She just turned and walked away, boots crunching in the snow, her shawl whipping behind her in the wind. She didn't know where else to go. She wandered back toward the train station, not because she had a plan, but because her legs needed somewhere to carry her. In the station was all she knew. The snow was falling harder. No, Clara stared at the empty tracks. She didn't have a return ticket, didn't have a room, didn't know a soul in this town. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not loud, not wild, just steady, quiet grief, a slow unraveling. She didn't even try to wipe them away. She sat there in the silence of snow, clinging to her lashes, sensor of what to do or where to go next. And when her fingers had gone numb and her legs stiff with cold, did she finally rise, not because she had direction, but because sitting in the cold wasn't living. She picked up her trunk, turned her back to the empty tracks, and began walking into Dry Creek. Into the unknown. Dry Creek wasn't much more than a cluster of wooden buildings, a few muddy streets, and a scattering of townsfolk with faces hardened by wind and winter. Clara walked through it like a ghost, jaw damp, trunk heavy, boots soaked through with slush. Didn't know where she was headed. All she knew was she couldn't stand still. At the far edge of town, she found a room for rent above the apothecary. It was small and draughty, with a slanted roof and a single bed barely big enough to stretch in, but it was dry, and for now it was Hirsch paid for the first 2 weeks with the last of her sewing money. Then slowly she began to stitch a life back together, thread by thread. She offered mending to the townsfolk, split seams, worn hemspatches for the boys who tore their pants sliding on frozen hills. She baked a few peas and offered them to the cafe in exchange for eggs, and Flirsch asked no favors, told no tales, but still the whispers came. That's the mail order bride who got turned away. Poor thing, shame about her. Figure, did you hear? She waited in the snow for our Clara kept her chin up, lips pressed like stitches. Heard worse, and beside us wasn't made to bend for anyone. Each morning she tied her apron, walked through town with her shoulders back, and proved that being rejected didn't mean being ruined. She made quiet friends. Mers Pickens at the bakery offered her day-old bread in trade for sugar. Stitching, the blacksmith's wife brought over a bolt of faded gingham and whispered, "It's good to have another woman who understands how to keep things together." But it was the general store where Clara began to feel something stir again, something she thought she'd left behind on that snow-covered platform. The general store in Dry Creek Sold everything from nails to rebonsto licorice sticks in a glass jarret was the heart of the town, always full of chatter and clinking coin, but at mid-morning it quieteth it. When Clara preferred to gosh it comin' for thread or fluralways with her basket on her armand. That's when she began to notice Heimly Cartwright work behind the counter, tall, soft-spoken, with spectacles perched on his nosy and a way of moving that said he didn't care much for crowds, wasn't flashy or loud like the younger man who hung around the saloon. It was still on day as Clara paid for a spool of green thread. Dilly glanced at the book, peeking from her basket. You like to read? He asked, his voice quiet. But Clara nodded, a little surprised. Romances mostly, she said lightly. I've needed happy endings. Smiled, not a smirk but a soft knowing smile. Might have one or two books tucked in the back that you'd enjoyin'. That was how it started. The next time she came in, a slim novel wrapped in brown paper was waiting by the register. No charge. Eli said, eyes down, just return it when you're donish did. And when she brought it back, they spoke for longer about the characters writing than about weather, pie crusts, prairie grass, and the way time feels different in the winter. Week by week the conversations grew, never too long, never too forward, but something began to stretch between them, warm and slow like sunlight melting ice. Never mentioned Jedidiana, never brought up the gossip that swirled around Clara like dust. Just looked at her like she wasn't some poor story he'd overheard, but a book he was still reading, curious, intrigued, and willing to wait for the next paggy. As the weeks drifted on and the snow softened into slush, Clara began stopping by the general store even when she didn't truly need anything. Sometimes she'd ask for buttons, other times molasses or fabric scraps, but always she'd linger just a little longer near the counter, and always Eli was there. He began setting books aside just for hurdles with brave-hearted women, and slow-growing love shed return, each one neatly wrapped, sometimes with a fresh pior, a pouch of her hand-stitched tea sachets tucked into the basket. Never asked for anything in return, but every time she walked through the door, stood a little taller, smiled a little softer. On chilly morning, Clara brought him a tart with a ribbon tied around the tin. It's cranberry, she said, setting it gently on the counter. Ellie blinked, touched, but unsure. This is too kind. Clara smiled. Kindness isn't meant to be measured. Mr. Cartwright looked at her, then not quickly it shyly, just looked like he was reading her again. And this time, understanding the meaning between the lines. Higher talks grew deeper, though never too long. Asked if she missed Homesh, asked about his late wife, and he spoke gently without pain. On afternoon, as she turned to leave, he called out softly. Clarash paused. Place feels different when you're Haresh. Didn't know what to say, so she simply smiled and held the warmth of his words like a secret under her shawl. All the way home, spring began to tease the edges of dry creek. Snow melted into rivulets along the dirt roads, and windows opened just enough to let the air in. And in her small upstairs room above the apothecary, Clara worked on something quietly. Night after neither mother's old quilt had traveled 1,000 miles with her, weren't familiar, stitched with the lives of women who came before her, but now Clara was adding new pieces, bits of gingham from the bakery, a prona patch from her own shawl, a sliver of fabric that matched the ribbon Eli had once admired. Every square was a memory. When the quilt was finished, Edge folded it carefully, wrapped it in brown paper, and carried it through town with hands that trembled. Only a little bell above the general store door chimed as she stepped. Incidentally looked up. Miss Jenkinsey, have something for you, she said, placing the bundle on the counter. Untied the twine, gently unfolding the quilt layer by layer. His fingers moved slowly across the stitching, pausing over the worn edges and new pattern. Shoe made this. Clara nodded. It was my mama's, but I added to a thought, maybe it could keep your chair warmer. Looked at her, really looked at his voice was quiet. No one's ever given me something like this. He smiled softly. Well, no one's ever made me feel safe enough. Tolly stepped around the counter, didn't rush. He simply took her hand, raw fingers, gentle grip, and said the one thing that reached deeper than she was ready for. You are the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. There left her lungs knit, because she didn't believe him, but because for the first time after she finally did. The town spring harvest dance was the kind of event that brought everyone out, even those who claimed they were too tired or too old. The schoolhouse was strung with lanterns, and the fiddler tuned up just as the sun began to dip behind the hills. Clara arrived alone, wearing a dress she'd made just for the occasion. Soft lilac with cream buttons. Her hair was pinned, her lips touched with rose petal balm. She hadn't come to dance, she told herself. She only wanted to watch the children twirl And the couple's lotto feel part of something just for Anne. Evening, but Eli had other plans. Stood near the punch table in a freshly ironed shirton. His usual quiet demeanor. His eyes found Clara the moment she stepped inside. And then he walked toward her, not quickly, not nervously, just like he'd did Edmus. Jenkins, he said, bowing slightly. Would you dance with me? Clara looked around at the people who'd whisper Edward watched her walk through snow and sorrow with her head higher. You sure? She asked gently. Ellie smiled very. Suresh placed her hand in his hand. The warmth there nearly undid her. They stepped onto the floor as the fiddler began a slow waltz, and the room seemed to quiet around theme. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. They moved together, his hand on her waist, theirs on his shoulder. Eyes locked, heart steady, and for a moment Clara forgot everything. Jedediath whispers. The frozen platformo that remained was the steady rhythm of this man who saw her like no one ever had, lit her under the stars outside the schoolhouse. Lee turned to Harry. Never expected to find love, her said, but then you walked into the store, and it was like everything I thought I'd lost came back. Clara's throat tightened, and you whispered, you didn't just look at me, you saw me. He stepped closer. Eve been seeing you, Clara, every day since the first, and when he kissed her, it wasn't rushed or unsure. It was the kind of kiss that says him, here I'm yours, and I've been waiting for you. A year later, under a sky that held the promise of summer, Clara stood beneath a blooming dogwood tree, dressed in cream lace she'd sewn by hand. The breeze played with the hem of her gown, and the scent of fresh earth and wild flowers lingered in the air. Beside her stood Eli. His hands were a little shaky, but his eyes, oh, his eyes held steady on hers, like she was the only thing he'd ever searched for and finally found. They were married on the hill behind the general store, where the prairie stretched wide and softened. Every guest could feel something sacred in the air there. Vows were simple, spoken gently beneath the trees, and when Eli said, I never knew peace until I met you, Clara's hand didn't tremble in his. Later they danced in the grass outside the store, where it had all begun. Woe, people who had weathered their own storms and still found the Sunelli leaned in, resting his forehead to her. You changed my life, he whispered. She smiled. No, you just reminded me who I already was. So if you ever feel like life has left you behind, if the world tells you you're too much or not enough, remember, Clara May Jenkins rode west with hope in her chest and was met with cold eyes and colder silence, but she didn't shatter, she didn't shrink. She found herself